November 14th, 1961, Harlem. In a mafia-backed restaurant, Bumpy Johnson took one bite of his steak and knew someone had just tried to kill him. He stayed silent, and by morning the chef vanished, and a freezer told the rest of the story. When an assassination reaches your mouth and you don't react who is about to pay the price, the Red Rooster did not feel dangerous that night. The lighting was warm, the tables were full, and the room carried the quiet confidence of a place that believed nothing bad ever happened there. For men with power, familiarity often masqueraded as safety. Bumpy Johnson had eaten in this room dozens of times. The staff knew his habits, his schedule, and the cut of steak he preferred without asking, which was precisely why the plate placed in front of him raised no alarms. Trust built slowly over years has a way of lowering every guard at once. The steak arrived exactly as it always did. A 12-ounce ribeye medium rare resting in butter that still shimmered under the lights, the scent of garlic and thyme drifting just enough to announce quality without excess. Nothing on the plate suggested urgency, danger, or betrayal. Bumpy cut into the meat with practiced ease. The knife slid cleanly, the resistance familiar, the motion automatic, as unremarkable as breathing. Around him, forks lifted, glasses clinked, and conversation carried on uninterrupted. He took one bite. It was not the taste that stopped him, because the flavor was perfect. It was the texture, a brief resistance between tooth and tongue that did not belong there. Years inside federal prisons had trained him for this moment without ever naming it. Men learned quickly that poison rarely announced itself with bitterness, and danger often hid inside meals prepared with care. Survival came from noticing what others swallowed without thought. Bumpy did not spit. He did not pause long enough for anyone watching to register concern, because concern was information, and information traveled fast in rooms like this. Instead, he let the bite sit, cataloging the sensation, while his face remained unchanged. He reached for his wine glass and took a slow sip. The motion looked ordinary, social, rehearsed, but it served a purpose only he understood. Whatever did not belong on his tongue was guided away, carefully controlled, unseen. The napkin came up next, not in panic, but in etiquette. He dabbed his lips with the same restraint he always used, folding the cloth with deliberate care. What others saw was refinement. What he created was evidence. He cut another piece of steak and raised it toward his mouth. The fork touched his lips, but he chewed nothing, allowing the meat to disappear into the napkin on his lap. Across the room, someone was watching, waiting for a sign that the attempt had worked. Bumpy gave them none. He finished his wine, set the glass down precisely where it belonged, and adjusted his jacket as if the evening had simply grown dull. Control in moments like this was not a reaction, but a weapon. When he stood, no one stopped talking. Chairs did not scrape, and no heads turned fast enough to look suspicious. He walked out of the Red Rooster as a man who had decided to end his night early, not as someone who had just escaped death. Outside, the air felt colder than it should have. The city moved the way it always did, unaware that a line had just been tested inside a dining room, filled with witnesses who did not yet know they had seen anything. Attempts like this were never meant to succeed quietly. By the time the car door closed behind him, Bumpy already understood the shape of what had happened. Someone in that kitchen had made a decision, and someone else had approved it by staying silent. The question was no longer whether this was an accident, but how many people already knew it was not. He did not speak during the drive home. Silence allowed patterns to surface, and patterns were more valuable than anger. In Harlem, retaliation without understanding created chaos, and chaos invited mistakes. The folded napkin rested in his hand, heavier than it should have been. Inside it sat the difference between a warning and a declaration of war, thin enough to be overlooked, sharp enough to kill. Every large conflict he knew announced itself first in small, almost polite ways. This was not yet a confrontation. It was a signal delivered with precision, testing whether he still noticed the things others missed. and by choosing not to react, Bumpy Johnson had already answered. No one inside the Red Rooster noticed the moment danger officially left the room. Chairs remained, filled conversations resumed their low hum, and the illusion of safety held. According to later accounts, those present recalled no visible alarm. Bumpy Johnson walked past the host stand without urgency. His pace did not change, his expression did not tighten, and his posture did not announce that anything had gone wrong. In rooms like this, panic was louder than a gunshot. He did not turn toward the kitchen. He did not scan the faces of the waitstaff or linger long enough to create suspicion. Looking for a culprit inside the restaurant would have been an admission that something had happened, and admissions created witnesses. Outside, the sidewalk absorbed him without comment. Harlem moved as it always did at that hour, cars rolling past couples, laughing music leaking faintly from open doors. The city had not felt the tremor yet, but it would. The car door opened before he reached for it. Curtis, his driver, noticed immediately that something was off, not because of what Bumpy said, but because of what he didn't. Silence, measured and deliberate, was a signal Curtis had only seen a handful of times. Bumpy settled into the back seat with the same care he always used. He did not adjust the mirror, did not look back toward the restaurant, and did not issue instructions beyond a single address. The vehicle pulled away as if nothing of consequence had occurred. As the distance grew, Curtis watched the street through the windshield. He had driven this route hundreds of times, but nights like this sharpened every detail. The quiet inside the car was heavy, controlled, and familiar in a way that made his hands tighten on the wheel. They reached the brownstone without incident. The door opened and Bumpy stepped inside as he always did, greeting the space with the calm routine of a man returning home. Only once the door closed behind him did the shift fully register. The napkin was still folded in his hand. He did not open it, yet did not inspect it again, and did not set it down immediately. Evidence, he understood, had more power when treated with patience. Inside the house was quiet. The stillness offered no relief, only room for the mind to move faster than the body ever could. This was the moment where survival turned into analysis. He allowed himself to sit. It was the first time that night his posture loosened, the first concession to the weight of what had nearly happened. Fatigue surfaced briefly, not as fear but as calculation. Attempts like this were never random. Kitchens were crowded, access was limited, and hands touched plates with intention. Whoever made that decision had believed the setting would protect them. Bumpy did not call anyone immediately. Reaction without context created chaos, and chaos benefited the wrong people. Control meant delaying action until the shape of the threat became clear. Curtis waited nearby, reading the cues he had learned over years. He had seen this attention once before on the eve of conflict that reshaped entire blocks. It was not rage and it was not panic, it was focus. When Bumpy finally spoke, his voice did not rise. The words were few, chosen carefully, and free of accusation. By sunrise, he wanted clarity, names, movements, and silence accounted for. The city outside continued as if untouched. Lights flickered on and off in windows, unaware that a private boundary had been tested. In Harlem, boundaries rarely announced themselves loudly. The napkin was placed on the table at last. Still folded, still unexamined by anyone else, it sat between ordinary objects as if it belonged there. The smallest items often carried the largest consequences. What had happened in that restaurant was not an attack meant to end a life immediately. It was a probe, a test of awareness and response. Those who ordered it were waiting to see which man walked out an oblivious one or a vigilant one. By choosing silence, Bumpy had answered without words. The hunt would not begin in public, and it would not begin with noise. It would begin where silence broke first. Later, some would say nothing unusual happened that night. They would remember dinner laughter and a man leaving early. They would not remember the moment Harlem quietly held its breath. The living room was rearranged without ceremony. Chairs faced inward, the table cleared. To bare wood, the lamps angled lower than usual. Nothing in the room suggested urgency, but everything suggested intent. Bumpy Johnson did not call it a meeting. Meetings implied debate, and there would be none. He spoke in short instructions, measured and final, the way men did when outcomes mattered more than emotions. The list was written by hand. 12 names, no titles, no assumptions, each one equal in possibility and suspicion. In investigations like this, hierarchy blinded judgment, so it was removed entirely. 12 employees meant 12 points of access. Any one of them could touch a plate, a pan, or a knife without raising suspicion, which made all of them dangerous until proven otherwise. The mistake most men made was choosing a suspect too early. Bumpy did not make that mistake. Accusation created resistance, and resistance erased patterns before they could be read. This phase required silence, repetition, and time. The rule was spoken once: watch first, act last. Anyone could be forced to talk, but fear produced noise, and noise distorted truth. Men were assigned to observe, not intervene. They stood where standing was normal, ordered what everyone else ordered, and learned the rhythms of the kitchen without interrupting them. Real behavior revealed itself only when it believed it was unobserved. The Red Rooster presented itself as a Harlem success story. Clean license, reliable suppliers, steady inspections, and a dining room that never lacked customers. On paper, nothing demanded scrutiny. Off paper, the numbers moved too smoothly. Liquor deliveries arrived without delay, inspections passed without friction, and late fees never appeared. Those were not signs of efficiency, they were signs of protection. Restaurants like this did not operate alone. Someone downtown had smoothed the early years, and those favors came with memory. Power never forgot where it had invested. Bumpy had learned long ago that kitchens were intersections, not endpoints. Food passed through them, but so did information money and quiet agreements that never reached the dining room. Whoever planned the attempt did not need to cook the steak. The first deviation came quietly. A staff member lingered after closing. Not to finish work, but to wait. Waiting without reason was always reason enough. No one followed him closely. Distance preserved invisibility, and invisibility preserved accuracy. Times were written down, routes, noted, faces memorized. The names surfaced indirectly, not from the kitchen itself, but from conversations nearby, men talking too freely in places they believed were neutral. Outsiders often mistook Harlem's noise for ignorance. The reports described someone unfamiliar moving between blocks without purpose. Drinks purchased for the wrong people, questions asked without urgency, familiarity offered too fast. It was not predatory behavior, it was preparatory. Bumpy did not respond when the name was spoken. Reaction would have narrowed the field prematurely, and premature certainty killed investigations. He let the name remain unresolved, suspended alongside the others. The list stayed intact. 12 names remained, 12 possibilities, even as attention widened beyond the kitchen. If the kitchen was the delivery method, the decision had been made elsewhere. Days passed without disruption. Shifts were worked, dishes cleaned, orders filled. The absence of mistakes was not comforting, it was calculated. Attempts like this were never impulsive. They were planned by men who believed time would protect them, that patience would dull attention. That belief was almost always their error. This was not the moment for punishment. Punishment without clarity created cycles, and cycles attracted attention Harlem did not need. Understanding came first, and consequence followed at its own pace. When the room finally emptied, the air felt heavier than before. Nothing had been resolved, but everything had narrowed. The shape of the threat was becoming visible, even if its edges remained soft. Bumpy remained seated after the last man left. The list lay in front of him, unchanged in ink, but altered in weight. Real power, he knew, did not rush when challenged. It watched, recorded, and waited for certainty. The files were spread out methodically, not stacked. Each page had space to breathe, as if distance alone might reveal what proximity concealed. In investigations like this, clarity came from separation, not accumulation. Bumpy Johnson read without comment. He did not skim and he did not jump ahead because details skipped once rarely returned. Names were weighed slowly, not for guilt but for history. One by one, the kitchen staff resolved into patterns. Paychecks arrived on time, debts were ordinary, and routines showed no stress fractures. Nothing in those lives suggested the patience required to attempt a quiet kill. The absence was telling. Desperation usually left marks: late payments, sudden moves, unexplained absences. Here the marks were too clean. Attention shifted from the present to the past. Old addresses, prior employers, family connections that never made headlines. History, it turned out, was where the list began to thin. That was when the first irregularity appeared. A death that existed only as a rumor, referenced sideways, never directly. It did not sit inside any official report, and it did not require explanation, because no one had ever asked for one. According to later accounts, records from that period remain incomplete. Paperwork was filed, then buried beneath routine and eventually forgotten. That was how quiet errors survived. The name associated with the death did not belong on the kitchen list. It belonged several years earlier in a different neighborhood attached to a man who had never been questioned because the matter was considered handled. Handled did not mean understood. It meant resolved quickly enough to keep operations moving. In cities like this, speed often passed for justice. The death had been written off as incidental. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong body, found too late to matter. No charges followed and no corrections were issued. But the living remembered differently. Family members had asked questions that never reached offices equipped to answer them. Silence settled in heavy and permanent. What emerged was not a motive built on money. There were no transfers, no unexplained deposits, no debts erased overnight. The account lines remained flat, consistent, unremarkable. That absence narrowed the field sharply. Contracts left trails, but resentment aged quietly. Time, not cash, was doing the work here. The file connected the death to the same kitchen through a human route, not a professional one. Employment overlapped years later, not immediately, which made the connection harder to spot. Patience again was the common thread. The name did not belong because it had never been part of the present problem. It was part of an older one that had been sealed too quickly. Closure had been assumed, not earned. Bumpy did not react when the implication surfaced. Reaction would have pulled the thread too fast, unraveling context before it could be read. He let the idea settle, testing its weight against everything else on the table. Silence in this case was not ignorance. It was accumulation. Years of unanswered questions had become pressure, and pressure required release. What followed in the records was a gap. Not an error, but an omission so ordinary it went unnoticed. No follow-up, no cross-check, no second look. That gap had done more work than any payment could have. It had allowed anger to grow without interruption, to sharpen without friction. When people waited long enough, opportunity felt like justice. The kitchen had offered that opportunity. Access without suspicion, repetition without scrutiny, and proximity without alarm. It was not the first plan, it was the last one. By the time the file closed again, the shape of the attempt had changed. This was not a hired act meant to disappear after execution. It was personal, calculated, and patient. Bumpy leaned back and said nothing. The room did not rush to fill the silence. Everyone present understood that conclusions reached too quickly were rarely correct. The name remained unspoken for a moment longer. Speaking it too soon would have turned it into an accusation. Accusations hardened positions, and this phase required flexibility. When it was finally acknowledged, it felt less like discovery and more like confirmation. The truth had been present from the beginning, hidden in what had been dismissed. This was not about money. It never had been. The strongest motive was the one that did not need reinforcement. The file was closed without ceremony, not because the matter was resolved, but because the direction was now clear. Understanding had replaced speculation. Outside Harlem continued its routine. The city did not know what had surfaced, and it did not need to. Causes rarely announced themselves before consequences followed. The name did not arrive with ceremony. It surfaced quietly, attached to a death that had been categorized too quickly and remembered too loosely. In the machinery of a smooth operation, some losses were logged only as friction. Bumpy Johnson listened as the account was reconstructed. Dates aligned, locations overlapped, and the logic of a mistake became visible in hindsight. Wrong place, wrong person, correct outcome for the system, if not for the family. The death had never been investigated as a crime that demanded repair. It had been handled a word that moved responsibility without settling it. Payments were made, arrangements concluded, and the ledger was balanced in the short term. But the balance was false. What had been closed administratively remained open morally, and morality did not expire on schedule. The absence of follow-up was not neutrality. It was a decision. The operation had continued without interruption. Routes stayed open, money flowed, and order was preserved, which was the point. Efficiency, however, had a way of masking its own damage. The brother was not a target. He was adjacent, present, visible, and misidentified at speed. Mistakes like that did not require malice, only momentum. No report captured the full sequence. There were no photographs circulated, no hearings convened, and no corrections issued later. The city moved on because it always did. For the family, the story did not end. Questions were asked privately, then less often, and finally not at all. Silence became a form of inheritance. Years passed, and the system interpreted the absence of noise as closure. That interpretation was convenient and wrong. Quiet was not forgiveness. It was compression. When the brother's name reappeared in the present, it did not feel new. It felt overdue. The connection was not emotional. It was structural. This was the first moment the operation faced the fact that some deaths never reached its accounting, not because they were unknown, but because acknowledging them would have slowed things down. Speed had been chosen instead. Responsibility, once deferred, does not dissolve. It migrates. It attaches itself to time, to proximity, to opportunity, and waits. The brother's death had created all three. Time had done its work. Proximity had been secured through routine, and opportunity had arrived disguised as normalcy. The kitchen was not coincidence. It was inevitability. Bumpy did not interrupt as the details were laid out. He did not contest the sequence or minimize its weight. This was not a debate about facts, but a reckoning with consequence. The room understood the shift. This was no longer about identifying a suspect. It was about identifying a debt. Debts could be postponed, but they could not be erased. There was no satisfaction in the clarity. Understanding arrived without relief. The realization carried its own gravity, heavier than anger and less useful than rage. The system had worked as designed. It had contained the immediate fallout and preserved stability. What it had not done was account for memory. Memory operated outside the structure. It waited where paperwork did not reach and decisions did not revisit. It waited with patience that outlasted policies. This was the first acknowledgement that the attempt in the restaurant was not random, not opportunistic, and not professional in the conventional sense. It was personal without being impulsive, precise without being rushed. Money had not motivated it. There were no transfers to trace and no incentives to uncover. The strongest engine here had been time. Bumpy allowed the silence to hold. In moments like this, speech would have been indulgent. What mattered was acceptance. Acceptance did not mean absolution. It meant recognizing that authority did not exempt anyone from consequence, only delayed it. Delay, as it turned out, had sharpened the blade. The brother's death had never been corrected. There was no public record to amend, no charge to reverse. What remained was the responsibility to respond in the present. The empire had been built to withstand attacks from outside. This one had grown inside the gaps it ignored. That was the cost of smooth operation. By the time the room emptied, nothing had been decided aloud. Decisions did not need witnesses. What had changed was the understanding of what was owed. Every organization kept a ledger, whether it admitted it or not. Some entries were written in ink. Others were written in time. This one had accrued interest. The account was due. He did not arrive angry. That was the first detail that mattered. Rage burned fast and drew attention, but this man moved with the patience of someone who had decided long ago what the end would look like. For 6 years his record was flawless. He arrived early, left late, corrected mistakes that were not his, and never raised his voice. Reliability over time became invisibility. Bumpy Johnson reviewed the timeline without interruption. 6 years was not coincidence. It was commitment. No one endured that long without purpose. The man did not threaten anyone. He did not ask for help, and he did not seek leverage through money or favors. He behaved as though the past had been settled, which was precisely how he wanted it to appear. Those who later reconstructed the sequence noted what was missing. There were no sudden financial changes, no unexplained payments, no signs of compensation or promise. Later accounts suggest no payment ever changed hands. Instead, the approach was personal and quiet. Conversations happened away from crowds framed as shared memory rather than accusation. He did not argue the facts. He revisited the wound. He reminded, not demanded. Names were spoken softly, dates recalled accurately, details left untouched long enough to sting. This was not persuasion through force, but alignment through grief. Time became the tool. Each year that passed without acknowledgement sharpened the grievance instead of dulling it. Silence, mistaken for resolution, was repurposed as fuel. The man learned the rhythms of the kitchen until they felt natural. He knew which shifts were quiet, which hands touched, which plates, and when attention drifted. Access did not need to be seized when it was granted daily. Trust accumulated the way dust did unnoticed until it covered everything. Familiarity replaced scrutiny, and routine replaced suspicion. That was how the final moment was prepared. This was not a crime planned in weeks or months. It was measured in seasons and anniversaries. Patience here was not restraint. It was rehearsal. By the time opportunity arrived, method was secondary. The goal had been fixed long before the means were chosen. When motive reached that depth, details became interchangeable. The kitchen offered efficiency, not creativity. It required no confrontation, no escape plan, and no explanation. It allowed the act to blend into normalcy. What made the attempt dangerous was not its brutality but its subtlety. It relied on trust, built slowly, not fear-imposed, suddenly. That distinction mattered. Bumpy understood this as the picture came into focus. This was not an external challenge to authority, but an internal correction to a past omission. The difference altered the response. Waiting had transformed the man. What began as grief had become precision. Anger had been replaced by discipline, and discipline by certainty. There was no pleasure in this realization. It stripped the situation of simple villains and simple solutions. This was not a warning meant to negotiate territory or money. It was an answer delivered late. An answer to a question that had never been formally acknowledged. The delay had not weakened it, it had refined it. In the room, no one spoke for several seconds. The silence was not confusion, but recognition. Everyone present understood that this kind of patience could not be bargained with. The man had not rushed because he did not need to. Time had already done most of the work. The attempt was merely the punctuation. Bumpy did not mistake this for mercy. Restraint was not forgiveness, and patience was not peace. Waiting in this case had been preparation. This was the final confirmation that money had never been the lever. Influence had not been purchased. It had been earned through shared memory and unaddressed loss. That made it harder to unwind. When the file was closed again, it carried a different weight. The threat was no longer abstract or strategic. It was personal, deliberate, and complete. The man who waited had believed the moment would end the story. What he had not accounted for was what followed patience on the other side. Waiting, after all, was not exclusive. The kitchen changed after closing. The noise drained out first, then the warmth leaving behind a room built for efficiency rather than comfort. Stainless steel reflected light without offering softness, and the floor held every sound. Bumpy Johnson entered last. He did not hurry and he did not scan the room because the moment did not require discovery. It required acknowledgement. No one was questioned at length. Questions created explanations, and explanations invited arguments that had already expired. This was not an investigation anymore. It was a conclusion. The man stood where he was told. His hands were free, his posture straight, and his eyes steady in a way that suggested acceptance rather than defiance. Panic had passed earlier. The others were positioned along the walls. They were not threatened, not warned, and not instructed to remember anything. Their presence alone was sufficient. Nothing was raised, and nothing was struck. Violence would have shortened the moment and diluted the message. This was meant to last. The freezer door sat at the far end of the room. Thick steel sealed edges and a handle worn smooth by years of use. It was designed to preserve, not to punish. The decision had already been made elsewhere. It did not arrive in this room as anger, but as inevitability. When choices reached this stage, words became unnecessary. The man spoke once. He did not plead for his life, and he did not deny what he had done. He explained briefly as if clarity might still matter. No one interrupted him. Interruptions implied negotiation, and there was none. His explanation changed nothing because the consequence had never been about correction. The freezer door was opened without ceremony. Cold rolled out immediately, thick and biting, changing the air in the room. The temperature did what threats never could. He hesitated for a fraction of a second. That hesitation was the last choice he would make that night. After that, movement belonged to the room. He was guided forward, not dragged. The distinction mattered because force would have allowed resistance. Compliance here was the point. The door closed slowly. Not slammed, not rushed, but sealed with precision. The sound was final without being loud. No one moved after it shut. The room held still, listening not for screams, but for understanding. The cold did its work without audience. Time passed without commentary. Minutes stretched long enough to register, but not long enough to be counted aloud. Counting would have personalized the act. The witnesses were not instructed to leave. They remained until the moment had fully settled, until the idea took root without reinforcement. Fear was not demanded. Memory would do the rest. When the door was opened again, the man was alive. His breath came shallow, his skin pale, and his hands no longer steady. Survival was not a concession. It was the sentence. He was wrapped and moved without urgency. Medical attention arrived without names, records, or questions. This was not concealment. It was completion. Bumpy Johnson did not look satisfied. Satisfaction would have implied relief, and there was none. What remained was gravity. He spoke once more quietly. The words were not a threat and not a warning. They were a boundary. The man would leave the city. He would not return, and he would not be pursued. What he would carry instead would ensure he never needed reminding. The freezer was closed and returned to service. Meat was stacked where it had always been stacked, and the kitchen resumed its function the next day. Normalcy restored carefully was part of the message. Those who witnessed the night did not speak of it publicly. They did not need to. Kitchens remembered without talking. The punishment did not end when the door opened. It continued in mornings, in stiffness, and in the knowledge that survival itself had become evidence. Living with it was the point. Cold replaced blood. Memory replaced fear, and consequence replaced spectacle. This was how the account was settled. Not with noise, not with headlines, but with a lesson that would outlast everyone in the room. The door opened without announcement. Cold air spilled out. First followed by the man who had entered it hours earlier under very different conditions. He was alive, which was never in doubt, but survival was no longer the same thing as return. He did not stand on his own at first. The stiffness was immediate and unforgiving, settling into joints and fingers that had once been precise. Whatever skill he had brought into the kitchen did not come back out with him. No one asked him how he felt. Questions invited conversation, and conversation invited sympathy, which was not part of the arrangement. The room remained quiet, allowing consequence to speak for itself. A doctor arrived without name or record. The examination was brief, efficient, and deliberately incomplete. According to later accounts, no court ever reviewed what happened that night. The verdict was simple. He would live, but he would never work the same way again. The hands that had measured heat and timing were now unreliable, and unreliability ended careers faster than accusation. Bumpy Johnson stood at a distance. He did not approach the man closely, and he did not offer comfort. Comfort would have suggested closure, and there was none. The boundary was stated clearly, and only once. The city was no longer available to him, and it would not be discussed again. Leaving was not optional. Returning was not permitted. Arrangements followed with the same restraint as everything else that night. A ticket was purchased, a departure time selected, and a route chosen that avoided attention. Disappearances, when handled correctly, required no drama. The envelope was placed where it could not be missed. It contained enough to start again somewhere warmer, somewhere anonymous, somewhere that did not remember. It was not payment for what had happened. It was a correction applied too late. Money could not balance the account, but it could prevent further damage. That was the extent of its purpose. Another envelope followed. This one was addressed to a cemetery, not a man. The stone would be replaced, the name spelled correctly, the dates restored to permanence. The gesture did not erase the past. It acknowledged it, which was different and more difficult. Acknowledgement arrived years after it was needed, and everyone in the room understood the delay mattered. No one called this mercy. Mercy implied forgiveness, and forgiveness had not been requested. This was mitigation, not absolution. The man did not speak as the terms were laid out. He nodded once slowly, as if confirming information he already knew. Acceptance at this stage was a survival instinct. He left before dawn. The city watched him go without noticing, which was the point. Leaving unnoticed was the last courtesy extended. In the days that followed, the kitchen returned to routine. New hands filled old roles, and schedules resumed their predictable rhythm. Normalcy restored, carefully closed the visible wound. What did not return was trust. It never did. Trust, once broken, changed form, rather than disappearing. Those who had witnessed the release did not talk about it. There was no benefit in repetition. Memory would carry the message more reliably than words. The story moved through Harlem the way cold did, quietly, gradually, without announcement. It reached every place that mattered, without ever appearing in print. There was no celebration afterward. No sense of victory settled in. Consequence, when understood fully, left no room for satisfaction. For Bumpy Johnson, the night added weight rather than relief. Authority did not protect him from the knowledge that delay had sharpened the outcome. Power had not failed, but it had not been timely. The ledger was not balanced. It was adjusted. Some entries remained unresolved, and some never would be. That was the cost of choosing efficiency over examination years earlier. Responsibility did not end when the man left the city. It lingered in the form of memory, reputation, and restraint. The city learned, but the lesson was not painless. This was not the end of the story. It was the narrowing of it. What remained would travel forward quieter and heavier than before. The release closed one chapter and opened another, that would not be written down. Consequence rarely announced itself with finality. It settled in and stayed. The story did not break the way stories usually did. There were no headlines, no police blotters, and no witnesses stepping forward with names. It moved instead through kitchens, barbershops, and back rooms carried by pauses rather than sentences. No one argued about whether it was true. Verification was unnecessary when consequences aligned so cleanly. In places where rumor failed, pattern confirmed. Bumpy Johnson did not send word himself. He did not need to. Messages were most effective when they appeared to arrive on their own. What traveled first was absence. A familiar face did not return to work, and a position was quietly filled without explanation. Silence, when shared by many, became instruction. Then an object changed hands. It was not dramatic, and it was not explained. Its meaning came from where it appeared and who did not question it. No note accompanied it. Notes invited interpretation, and interpretation invited error. The object spoke clearly enough. Those who understood kitchens understood immediately. Tools remembered more than people did, and people remembered what tools could do. The message did not require repetition. Across Harlem, behavior adjusted. Conversations ended. Sooner questions were left unasked, and curiosity learned to recognize its limits. Boundaries did not need reinforcement once they were understood. The effect reached beyond the restaurant. Attempts to recruit quietly stopped not because they were forbidden, but because they were unnecessary. The cost of testing had become too visible. There were no meetings to formalize the change. Nothing was written down, and no agreements were signed. What mattered was what did not happen afterward. No one tried again. Not in that way, not in that place. The absence of repetition was the clearest proof that the message had landed. This was how reputation functioned at its highest level. It was not built on what occurred, but on what never occurred again. Memory replaced enforcement. Years later, people would recall the period as stable without being able to say why. Stability in this case was the residue of restraint. It left no monuments. There was no satisfaction to be taken from this. The outcome did not restore what had been lost, and it did not correct the delay that had allowed it to happen. It merely prevented the pattern from repeating. The city adjusted its posture. Not visibly, not dramatically, but subtly enough to matter. Harlem had always understood consequence better than spectacle. The object completed its circuit and disappeared. Objects like that always did. What remained was the understanding attached to it. Those who might have challenged the boundary reconsidered, not out of fear but out of calculation. Calculation, unlike fear, tended to last. There were no follow-ups, no need for reminders. Reminders suggested doubt, and doubt had already been answered. The story did not age into myth. It stayed practical, specific, and contained. Myths grew louder over time. This one grew quieter. In the absence of noise, the message continued to work. Kitchens stayed orderly, access stayed limited, and patients learned to coexist with caution. The system corrected itself without instruction. For those who watched closely, the lesson was precise. Power did not announce itself when tested. It responded once decisively, and then returned to silence. The boundaries held because they were not defended daily. They were remembered. Memory, unlike force, did not exhaust itself. There were no apologies issued and none expected. Apologies suggested equivalence, and there was none. What existed instead was acknowledgement, delayed and incomplete, but finally present. The city did not need to know the details. It only needed to recognize the pattern and avoid repeating it. That recognition traveled faster than any explanation could have. The ledger remained open in places no one would ever see. Some entries could not be balanced, only carried. Carrying them was part of the cost. This was how the matter concluded. Not with closure, but with containment. Containment in this case was enough. Nothing more was required. Nothing more was attempted. The message had done its work. It began with a sensation no one else noticed. A brief resistance on the tongue, easy to dismiss, impossible to forget once understood. In that instant, one life continued forward, while another quietly crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. There was no courtroom at the end of this story. No charges were filed. No verdict read aloud, and no official record ever carried the full weight of what happened. Justice arrived instead as consequence, silent and permanent. The kitchen grew quieter after that night, not from fear but from understanding. Harlem absorbed the lesson without applause and without forgetting. If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more cases, history never recorded cleanly, and leave a comment. Would you have stayed silent or exposed the truth immediately?